Hey everyone, so have you ever wondered where the rules that protect our air, our water, and all our natural spaces actually come from? Well, you're in the right place. Today, we're going to break down the fundamentals of environmental law. A good way to think about it is like we're building a shield piece by piece to protect the environment. So, let's get started. Here's our roadmap for today. First, we'll take a quick trip through history to see where these ideas started. Then, we'll look at the creation of the EPA, the main environmental agency in the US. After that, we'll dive into the big federal laws, see how states are often a step ahead, and then zoom out to look at the global picture. And, of course, we'll wrap up with the key takeaways you'll want to remember. All right, first up, let's go back in time. The idea of protecting the environment isn't really a new thing. It's actually a concept that societies have been thinking about for literally thousands of years, way before it was a major headline. Check this out. This timeline shows a really consistent thread running through human history. We're talking about forest protection laws in ancient and the Roman Senate making rules to keep water safe, and this concern just keeps popping up. Fast forward to people like Benjamin Franklin fighting pollution, and of course, Rachel Carson's work exposing the dangers of pesticides in the 60s. Each of these moments shows a growing awareness that, our actions have consequences. So all this concern eventually reached a boiling point. By the 1970s, it was clear that the U.S. needed a single, powerful agency to act as the nation's environmental watchdog. So what is the EPA? The easiest way to think about it is as the country's main referee for all things environmental. It was officially created back in 1970, and its mission was super clear: protect the environment from damage, no matter if that damage comes from the government or from a private company. Okay, so how does the EPA actually get the job done? Well, its work really follows a pretty logical four-step process. First, it monitors the environment to figure out what's going on out there. Then, based on that data, it does research into specific problems. That research helps it create smart policies. And finally, and this is probably the most important part, it enforces those policies to make sure the laws actually have some teeth. So with the EPA in place as the enforcer, Congress started creating the tools it would need to do its job. These big federal laws are like the first, most important layer of our environmental shield. Now, don't get overwhelmed by this list, but this is basically the legislative backbone of environmental protection in the U.S. The key thing to notice is the pattern here. Each law targets a specific problem. You've got the Clean Air Act for air, the Clean Water Act for water. Simple enough, right? Then you have laws like the Safe Drinking Water Act for our taps and the Superfund Act, which was designed to clean up old, toxic messes. Altogether, they create this really comprehensive legal shield. But here's a really crucial point. Just having a law on the books isn't enough, not by a long shot. Making it work in the real world can be incredibly tough. Enforcement might get held up because there's not enough funding, or it gets slowed down by a ton of bureaucracy, or sometimes it gets stuck completely because of political fights. But the federal government is not the whole story. While those national laws set a minimum standard, states can, and often do, create even stronger protections. And when we talk about this, California is always the classic example of a state that really takes the lead. Here's a great way to think about the difference between federal and state law. Federal rules basically set the floor. That's the absolute minimum level of protection that every single state has to provide. But states like California have looked at that floor and said, nope, not high enough for us. So they've built on top of it with much stricter rules, especially for things like car emissions. And here's the proof of just how influential a state can be. California's policies often become the blueprint for the entire country. This quote right here shows that a huge update to the Federal Clean Air Act was actually based on a law that California had already passed a couple of years earlier. It's like the state was paving the road for the rest of the nation to follow. Pretty cool. Okay, now let's zoom out, way out, because problems like pollution, climate change, and endangered species, well, they don't stop at the border, right? And that means for a protective shield to really work, it has to be global. But as you can imagine, getting almost 200 countries to agree on anything is, well, it's complicated. The biggest hurdle is this idea called national sovereignty, which is just a fancy way of saying that every country wants to make its own rules. Think about trying to get your whole dorm to agree on one set of quiet hours. Now imagine that on a global scale. It's tough. But even with those challenges, there have been some major successes.
So this table gives us a quick snapshot of a few landmark international agreements. The Montreal Protocol is a huge success story. It basically got the entire world to stop using chemicals that were destroying the ozone layer. Then there's CITES, which protects tens of thousands of species from illegal trade, and the Kyoto Protocol, which was a historic, if controversial, first attempt to get countries to agree to cut greenhouse gas emissions.
Okay, we have covered a ton of ground, from ancient laws all the way to global treaties. So let's boil it all down into the 3 essential things you should absolutely take away from this. If you're studying for a quiz, this is your slide.
First thing to remember, environmental protection isn't just one law. It's a multi-layered system. You've got the federal laws setting the baseline, state laws pushing things further, and international treaties that get everyone to cooperate. Each layer plays a different but really important role.
Second, the EPA is the main player for environmental rules in the United States. It's the agency that handles the science, helps create the policy, and, most importantly, does the enforcing that makes these laws actually mean something.
And the third big takeaway is this: a law is only as strong as the will to enforce it. Success is never a guarantee. It really depends on having enough funding, political cooperation, and just the plain hard work of turning words on a page into real action in the world.
So, looking at this whole history leaves us with a really important question for the future. What do you think is the next big environmental challenge that's going to require us to forge a totally new layer for our protective shield?